All right, welcome everyone. So excited to share this transmission, this conversation with y'all. This is Emily Lynx Racket, and we've been connected for a number of years, just kind of like on the other side of the community, winking at ourselves, and have come together in this shared path of love for these expanded states of consciousness, psychedelics, but also really deeply trying to understand what this human experience is all about. And I feel like both you and I in our lives have, found these tools and are at a time in our lives where we're just like amalgamating that to offer, to give people a foundation, a blueprint to navigate life through. And so, yeah, you have a deep love and passion for psychedelics and plant medicines and ceremonies, but have been deeply immersed in first human design for about a decade now. Then really diving deep into the gene keys, but also studying yoga and tantra, and now really putting it all together. So really excited to chat with you today, kind of like harvesting all the juice from your beautiful mind. So welcome. So stoked to have you here.
Yeah, thank you. So glad to be here and share this. It's really been something that I've come to realize has been such a profound way to navigate reality, ultimately, especially using the gene keys in all the ways that I have, as well as human design. But the correlation between the voyage of the gene keys and the psychedelic realm is incredible. So it's definitely something that I want to offer to people to, park in their awareness. There is ways that we can support each other and ourselves on this journey, and have it be something that provides a lot of clarity ultimately into self. And that's really what it's all about.
Yeah, and so today we're talking about how the gene keys specifically can help us integrate a psychedelic experience. And I think before we, like, it's such a big thing to unpack, before we jump into the gene keys and what they are and how we can use them, I think it'd be helpful to give context to, like, well, what is the psychedelic journey? What is happening there? And even how that in itself, the psychedelic journey, is also like is a mirror of the human journey, the hero's journey that you alluded to earlier before, and how, we've incarnated these like infinite, beautiful God sparks of a being into human form, have completely forgotten the truth of reality, and operating from this like ego which is just inundated with programs and woundings and forgettings, and trying to like wake up through this suffering as our soul is being asked to grow and expand, and then enter psychedelics.
Yeah. Yeah. Expedites that whole journey.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is definitely helpful, when I do speak to this in the psychedelic journey. It's also speaking to, again, life's journey as well as the gene keys voyage. And ultimately it's a journey into presence. It's a journey into embodiment, right? It's like, how do we allow ourselves to fully be expanded and flooded with consciousness, with spirit, with radiance, with life force, whatever term you use to describe this relationship with life and what it means to be alive and animated. And ultimately, I've found, at least the psychedelic journey, that's its motivating drive, you could say, is coming up against the areas in our body, in our physical body, emotional body, mental body, and spiritual body, and all of the spheres that we have, and so on, the fractal spheres that are running through us. It comes up against the areas in which we have constricted and repressed life force. So it comes and shows us either gently or very abruptly where those areas may be through their layers. And so once we come to terms with what that area in ourselves are that we've perhaps either, collectively inherited as a constriction, or something that over time in our experience of this incarnation, we found more constriction around. It's really all the same thing, the way that it, pulls through the aeons. And so it comes up against this constriction and gently or abruptly shows us what it is, ultimately, so that we have the opportunity to see that, witness it, come to terms with it. This is what it is, to come to terms with it in a way where we accept it as us. We accept it, we allow, accept, and embrace it. And when there's that moment of being with that constriction, that shadow, that darkness, whatever that is that triggers you in the psychedelic journey, to be with it in a way where it's peaceful. You come to peace with what that is. And when that happens, and a lot of the times that'll happen with our breath, when we can breathe fully into the constriction, it'll start to open. The gateway will start to open, the window into the self will start to open. And when that happens, there's more space for presence, there's more space for embodiment. And that's what I have found, if we distill it all down, the psychedelic journey, which is very wide and exciting and adventurous, and there's all these different pathways, but I think at the core of it, that's really what is happening. How to open those contracted spaces, expand them, and let more life through. And that continues to be the journey, because truly there are always areas that we can open more. And even if you're in your own self, in your own body, if you really open to everything and you're in full presence and embodiment, then the universe will be like, oh, great, you're an amazing vessel to transmute and feel and come to terms with all of these repressed energies that are in the collective field. So it's really the process and the practice of like, how do we get really good at opening and expanding the contractions? And it's like a part of this, just on another tangent, just to say, I just thought of this right now, because that's like the micro experience that we're having. But where I feel like we're even at right now is the macro experience of like the earth having birth contractions. Like we're coming into a new age of evolution, and I think it's a really beautiful thing to consider, the micro to the macro, and how it's all feeding back on itself with each other. So yeah, how to get really good at giving birth.
Thank you for that, man. There's so much I want to like tease out and like expand on, but yeah, as you're saying, like for me, really narrowing this work down is Bufo, like 5-MeO, has been a really big teacher. That when I come back to these maps, it's like, oh, now I get it. Before I was like grasping at the understanding, and I could feel the mechanics of my mind and my ego trying to like, yeah, everything is love. Okay. But then you come into these huge expanded states of consciousness, the veil is lifted, you can see the truth. And for some people that's just like mind blowing, totally altering, and they come back and they don't know how to orient to like taxes and like mortgages and a job, but I'm like spirit and love, like what? And so to be able to come back and have these like blueprints, it's like, yeah, we have totally forgotten in this human form what we actually are, but we're not totally lost. There's maps. It's like there is a force and a greater intelligence that's guiding guiding us back to it, back to source. And in this life, we are like a conduit, which you had said, like this vessel is a conduit, electromagnetic chemical body of conduction that is pulling in consciousness and pulling in light, right? And that light is pure love, light, source, God consciousness, whatever word you want to put on that. And as we grow through life, the human ego develops and like that, and it begins to contract some light, hold some light, becomes more dense in areas, and that life force can't move and becomes trapped. And that's where our suffering gets put in place, our armor, our blocks, and that place of enlightenment as we awaken, really it means shining light at those dark places, on those dense places, on those contracted places. And it's like breaking through our shell of forgetting, so we can be that conduit of love light consciousness again, and true remembrance and attunement to higher self. And that's that hero's journey that we break through. And I feel like the gene keys are those keys that are the main components of constriction, where we've been blocked, that are in our blind spots, that is in the shadow. So it's like the gene key is the map to the shadow, the constrictions, the gates, the portals, that when we begin to shine light, it literally is transforming our consciousness, our DNA, our light body, so that we can receive source consciousness with a greater ease. And we don't, it's like all of a sudden we've been in the dark and we've been trying to navigate life, like trying to figure it out, like, what is this thing? Okay. And then all of a sudden the lights come on and we're like, oh, yes, pen, I get it. I know how this works. I can move forward.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. That's such a impeccable description of that process and how the gene keys works in that way. And just one more thing to really crystallize down, and it's something that I really appreciated about the gene keys, because we're talking about integration, right? Like you said, like the integration is how to bring all of that, which is a lot in those realms, down into the physical, ground it into our core stability so that we can continue to live in a really solid way on this foundation of the earth and this physical body, which is really what we're here for, right? Like, how do we descend into self? And I feel like it's just an important thing to bring up in contrast, because in a lot of the spiritual spaces or even psychedelic spaces, there's a lot of like ascending. How do we ascend, ascend, ascend? But it's really like the Gene Keys brings it down to, now we're descending into matter. We're spirit descending into matter. And as we do that, we illuminate these constricted places in our bodies. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really great piece to touch on. It's like, no, we need to actually ground this. We need to be in the body, embodying these qualities, embodying qualities of understanding, embodying qualities of humility, of grace, these gene keys, to then create that heaven on earth, right? There's so many of these teachings that, we think we're going to ascend into heaven, but it's like heaven is a state of consciousness. It's gratitude, it's love, it's innocence. And we create it through embodying that. And for those of you on the call, you probably know it's like, it's not that easy just to like be graceful or be forgiving, right? It's like, it's tumultuous. There's so much charge in the shadow. It's just like intense. It's intense. Energy is intense. And to be able to transmute that, that's what the integration process is. It's like, how do we take these realizations that we can philosophize about forever, but then how do we actually embody that when we're faced with challenge, with I like the word catalyst, right, in our life? Or if it's a partner, if it's something happening at work, or an argument, or when you're triggered and you just want to fucking just that person. It's like, okay, how do I embody love in this moment where all I want to do is just rip your face off? In practical terms, practical human advice, what do we do?
I feel like it would be such a good time right now to really speak about that journey, with the shadow through the gift into the city, because it's matches perfectly to what you just brought up.
Yeah, so let's dive into the gene keys. So I'm gonna share my screen here, while you give a little like nutshell of like, what is the gene keys? If I came off the street and I was like, is it like a key that you open it? Like, what are the gene keys? Can you give us a little rundown of what it is?
Yeah. So the gene keys are truly a living wisdom, and they're a means of unlocking an enormous amount of potential in your life. And it's a living wisdom in two parts. One, it's in itself, the synthesis is a living, breathing organism that takes on its own life through different vessels, but then it's also wisdom that lives within you, as every gene key, and there's 64, has a corresponding codon in your DNA. So we can kind of think about this as genetic archetypes, where we get to know these gene keys that are really speaking to these genetic archetypes that are playing stories through our DNA that we are then experiencing as the experiencer. So we get to know a lot of our patterns through this. And there's many different ways, different spheres to speak to that we'll look at when we look at Aga's profile here in a minute. But yeah, so ultimately that's a little bit about what that is, and it goes very deep and very wide, and it's really like an infinite journey into self-illumination, an educational voyage into self-illumination. And yeah, I'm excited to share more with you. If we look at your profile, I think it'll be helpful for people to get a reference.
Yeah.
So the pattern, the profile is, of course, so it's like a unification between the archetypal genetics with your astrological calculations. So as long as you have your birth, place, time, and date, then you can derive your profile, and we can take a look at this mapping of self.
Yeah, and it's also based in the I Ching as well, right?
Yeah, so the I Ching, it's really, Gene Keys and both human design are really like a synthesis of every kind of integral philosophy that you could find, and it brings it kind of up to date to where we are now. And the I Ching is definitely a huge part of Gene Keys, and you'll see the hexagrams around the wheel of the profile, and there's 64 hexagrams, as there are 64 Gene Keys. And the Gene Keys kind of takes like this spin, you could say, on the I Ching. And then there's also the line numbers, as you can see here, like Aga's life's work says the 50th Gene Key with the 4th line number. And so these line numbers also come from the hexagrams from the I Ching. And this is kind of how we get to see these patterns. And because I used to study Asian philosophy in school, actually, and the I Ching was definitely one of the philosophies that I found spoke the highest truth. So,
Yeah, for me, like in simplest terms, is my map, the map for my soul's evolution in this incarnation. Like, before we incarnated, you're like, great, I want to learn about innocence, and I want to learn about compassion and wisdom, and I'm going to learn it in these sadistic ways, right? Through the suffering, right? We have to know the polar end of it to understand the gift of it. So I love that the Gene Keys has the shadow when you transmit, which is like the challenge, the catalyst. Like, right, if we aren't integrating it, there can be a lot of suffering there. And then when we move through that, there's the gift of it, and then like the superpower, the siddhi. And the siddhi is like the thing that the soul wanted to learn about, but we have to learn about it through polarization, through duality.
Yeah, I'll expand on that a little bit more, because that was the key that we were going into. There's lots of keys. So there's
I wanted to share, this is my soul's journey, to be totally transparent with y'all. This is who I am.
I like that you titled it Core Wound Navigation, because that is exactly what it is. So yeah, there's different ways we can look at it here, but that's definitely one that I look at a lot. So yeah, this is Aga's profile here. And if you can see, there's 3 frequency bands, 3 words that are written next to each sphere, and those correlate with the gene key itself. So for example, her life's work is the 50th gene key. And so it moves from the shadow of corruption, that's the trigger, that's the challenge, into the gift, the pathway, her creative genius, her creative expression of equilibrium. And that pathway creates this access point to her highest embodiment, her true essence of harmony. So that's the Siddhic frequency band. And so to wrap back what we were speaking to before, the Siddhic frequency band, spirit like um, this universal consciousness, it's always here. That flame is always lit. We're just clearing the pathway to it, right? So that's an important part of the framework to realize, is that Siddhi is always on within everyone. It's just through this process of incarnation where we have forgotten the depth of who we are, you could say. That's where we go on this journey through the shadow into the gift, and where we find that true essence of the Siddhi that's always there. And so in this internal alchemy, um, it works as we allow and accept and embrace the shadow, because that process releases the gift and gives you that pathway to your highest embodiment. So that's really, there's a lot of keys of the gene keys again, but to cultivate awareness around your shadows, your triggers, your challenges, so that when you see them playing out in the moment, or when you confront them in your psychedelic experiences, then, okay, so I'm going to sit with this. I'm not going to try to change it. I'm not going to try to run away from it or repress it or pretend like it's not there, or even think that it shouldn't be there. I'm just be with it. And that's the allowing. And eventually it turns into accepting. You accept it, you come to terms with it, you come into peace with it. And at that level, you're already at a different resonance. Acceptance, peace is a different resonance than having a problem with the problem. Right? So you come into peace with it, and you're automatically at that point already at the gift, because your frequency is shifted. And that gift, there's many spheres in the gene keys that show where your gene keys are and how they relate to that theme and their corresponding gift. But that is your genius. When I say genius, I mean you're tapping into the highest expressions of your genes. So an analogy that I really like to use with that alchemy between the shadow, the gift, and the Siddhi is, the shadow is like the seed underneath the ground that you may not know that it's even there. It's under the ground until you do get to see it or experience it, and then you have an opportunity to nourish it. Give it the right amount of sunlight and water and soil to be able to grow its potential, which is the gift, the flower. And then the flower becomes the fruit, which is the Siddhi. So the key there is that both the flower and the fruit contain the seed. And so that's, just that framework, to adopt that framework, to know that our shadows, our triggers, our challenges contain all the potential of who we truly are. It's just a matter of accepting them. They're gifts in disguise. It's like, how do we accept our shadows? Because it's that acceptance that nourishes it and allows us to come into this bloom of self.
Yeah, the bloom of the self.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating when you begin to look at the gene keys and really contemplate them and reflect. And I just realized, as you were pointing out, harmony in my life's work, that's the Siddhi, and the shadow is corruption. And my whole life, there has been themes of corruption everywhere. It's like I was exposed from the smallest age, like the corruption of, the nuclear family, the corruption of people in authority, the corruption of, in South America, I spent time with the shamans, the corruption of shamans and the misuse of their power, the corruption of studied nutrition, the corruption of the health industry, that it's actually a disease management system, the corruption of pharmaceuticals, the corruption of our government. It was just like, I had been living and surrounded with corruption being reflected back to me. And it was like, I can't trust anything at face value. Nothing on this planet is actually has integrity, seeing through all the lies constantly. And I feel like right now on the planet, it's almost like being unearthed from everywhere. It's like the corruption in our shadow. And through that corruption, specifically in the plant medicine realms, I saw how not to do it. Right. And that taught me through that of okay, how do I actually birth harmony through that, integrity through that? And it was we learn the Siddhi through the shadow, right? Being birthed through the seed, through the darkness, towards the light. And like, so with those of you who get their map and begin to see the keys, really reflecting like how they've been, playing a pivotal role in your development this whole time. And now you can actually, see with more clarity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely interesting to reflect on how it is that these themes have shown up through your life. And, that being said as well, karmically, and there's a pathway of karma in there, we call those themes in, right? Those triggers, because that's our map into self-illumination. So every shadow contains a gift, and it's through the shadow that we find the gift. Suffering is grace in that respect. So, but it is interesting as well, just to say, like, this map, this hologenetic profile, we call it, it becomes really your lens of perception. So it's not only like through resonance or calling in, through the law of correspondence, you're calling in those patterns so that you can be triggered by them, but you view them through your patterning. That becomes your lens of perception. So, when you contemplate it in that respect, it becomes very interesting. Like, okay, how am I seeing this? Why am I seeing it in that way? What is there for me to integrate? And yeah, the answer is lots.
Yeah. And okay, so I wanted to share the story of how I decided to contemplate on some of these, because the word contemplation, I was like, how do we contemplate? And I thought to do a dyad with them. And so I don't know, for those of you who are new to dyads is a partner practice where you and your partner sit across from one another and you work with an instruction. And this is a Zen koan practice that leads to a state of kensho, which is enlightenment, or a deep understanding of wisdom that comes from within. And usually you work with a statement like, tell me what love is. The person replies, you say thank you. They reply back, tell me what love is. I tune in to feel and reflect on that and respond back. And it goes back and forth with the same instruction over and over again, so that you can really begin to excavate what that thing is. And so we decided, Deus and I decided to do one on one of our spheres, right? So we began to contemplate a shadow. And so my shadow was intolerance. And I couldn't connect to that one. I was like, I don't see intolerance. Like, I don't get how that's in my life at all. Right. And sometimes we're so oblivious to our shadow because it's so behind us that it's just totally denied. And that's one of the funny things about shadow work, is like when someone reflects back to us, maybe some not so nice feedback of how we're responding, we can get activated and triggered because it's like, nah, but actually, yes. And I found that when we began to contemplate in a dyad format, the instruction, there was two components. There was, tell me what intolerance is. And so going in and describing intolerance, and then tell me what intolerance is not. And then you went to go describe what ended up actually being the city. You could see the seed going towards the city and going back and forth. What is intolerance? What is it not? What is it not? And the examples that I began to harvest of what is intolerance, I was able to see how I was intolerant. I was like, ooh, there it is. But it's coming from within, and I was able to accept it in myself because my defense mechanisms were down, because I was contemplating intolerance out here. But then I could feel it in here. And it was like really powerful shadow work. And then the answers that came through to what intolerance is not were all the qualities of what understanding is. And that's the gift of that gene key, intolerance into understanding. And you could see the natural evolution of these energies. And I found that the dyad practice is so powerful because you could feel consciousness reorganizing itself with this practice, through the practice of witnessed contemplation. And what really makes me so happy is as I'm feeling this, I'm like, oh, my DNA is activating. I can just feel my my upgrades.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's a great way to work with it. Absolutely. And it is interesting when you get to that point. Like, something to say with anyone who generates their profile that hasn't yet and looks at these codes. These words go so much deeper than you may perceive initially at face value, right? Because we come in with all these preconceptions of like, oh yeah, I know what forgiveness is, I know what humility is, equilibrium. But when you really dive into the gene key, and there is a gene keys book, it has all the gene keys, so you can go into them and read them. um, you definitely find new perspectives than uh, you definitely find new perspectives. And that's an interesting thing you brought up, even with your life's work with corruption, because it's like, yeah, there's all these reflections of corruption around you. But with that shadow in particular, with corruption, it's more like it's corruption of the mind, of how you're seeing things, right? Because the gift of that one's equilibrium, and the truth, which might still trigger people, is everything is always in equilibrium in nature, right? Whether it's good or bad, it's all always in equilibrium. Um, and so it's interesting when you perceive it in that lens as well. And just to touch on the art of contemplation a little bit more, so contemplation is the approach of the gene keys synthesis, and it's something that's very useful as a tool to adopt when you're integrating your psychedelic experiences. And in part, the way we use it in the gene keys is you contemplate these codes, these themes in your life, what that gene key is, and whether it's the shadow, the gift, and the city, and the line number. And it's a very gentle, peaceful, patient approach into what that archetype is. And as you focus your energy there, your awareness there, you begin to activate and turn on that code within your DNA. So it starts to light up with your awareness. That's really what we're using here. It's like, how do we cultivate awareness of these patterns so that we can have access to them in our own, spheres, in our own bodies? So you start to unlock them. And as you hold your awareness there further, it starts to grow, and then you begin to have this experience with what it actually did to your body, like the magnetism of it, the levity of it, the gravity of it. And that's something that hit me so profoundly when I first started getting into the gene keys, is I was like, oh yeah, I feel this in a real way in my body. Like it's speaking truth to my cells, and I feel that. And the gene keys in that respect is also similar to like neuro-linguistic programming. The whole thing in truth is rewiring your synapses of how it is that you relate to the triggers in your life. And that's also in part what the psychedelic journey is offering as well.
So well put. Yeah, and so just wanted to give a note that we're kind of not wrapping up, but as we're coming into a lot of topics in our conversations, to really begin to open up the floor for questions. So if you have a question, just type it into the chat, and then we can address them as we go along in the conversation. Yeah, yeah. As another thing that before I got into the gene keys, integration practices would come through. We have these ceremonies, and after we ask, what are you more aware of now? Knowing these things, what is one thing you want to do to live this knowing more fully? And from there you get self generated wisdom of how you'd like to integrate your experience, and whatever you feel called to, with the themes that were coming through. And for me, for a long time, what kept coming through was like play, 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 play. And I was like, what? Like, my shadow work is play? Like, okay, this is fun. This is easy. Like, just play more and like reconnect to the child and innocence. And this theme just kept coming through of the child and of play and of innocence. And then I opened up my gene key, and like in my evolution sphere, there's the third gene key, where it speaks about chaos moving into innocence. And when I went to go listen to Richard Rudd's explanation of the third gene key, like a huge thing of that was play. It's like innovation and play is the energy that takes chaos into new ways of being and insights. And like, this is a really huge pivotal aspect of my being. And when I figured that out, I was like, oh, no, this is like even more important. Like, of course, play is like so integral to my being, and a catalyst in my transformation right now. And sometimes oftentimes the shadow work doesn't have to be so serious, and it just gave me more I don't know what the word is, but just more excitement about how all of these experiences and maps and blueprints are weaving together. It's like it's the same voice coming at us from all of these practices, like beckoning for us to remember and to grow and to expand. And it's so synchronistic when they line up like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And that's something that I've definitely found integrating. That's where I first really came to how the hologenetic profile of the gene keys corresponds like so perfectly to the psychedelic experience and what keeps coming through. And so it's helpful to use the gene keys in that way to like really integrate and expand and elaborate on and gain like so many different perspectives on what that theme is that keeps coming through in your psychedelic journey. It enhances it in so many ways. And yeah, I feel the play because that's the third gene key is my purpose. So I get you.
Yeah. So we got a question from Austin and Emily,
Yeah.
asking if we've ever used the gene keys to integrate your own psychedelic experience, and if you had any. So I want to pass that question on to you, but I want to tag on that experience I just had with the play. That came from an experience where I was like, what? I couldn't really make sense of it, but I regressed from being in the womb, and my consciousness developed into being a 12-year-old. So I was actually playing out being a toddler. I was like, la, 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 bottle, bottle, words, just like kind of, it was just Deus and I, and he's like deep in his like, oh, like whatever download he's getting, and I'm just like being a toddler. And I go to the bathroom and I'm like, oh my God, I love glitter. I have a vagina. I have a crush on a boy. And I go through puberty and I go back into the space and I'm all like shy because I have this crush on a boy. And I'm like, how old are you? I'm 9. I like purple. And like I was just so immersed in being this innocent child developing. And when the ceremony was over, it was like, what the fuck was that about? Like, what did that rewire in my brain? And the whole time I thought Deus was a toddler as well. Like I was so convinced that we were both kids. And he was like, no, that was just you and your experience. I was just like completely elsewhere. And like a part of me felt like a little embarrassed and ashamed of like, oh my gosh, like I went so deep into play, and literally my consciousness regressed. And from there sparked that theme of innocence, coming back to our innocence, coming back to play and creativity. And innocence is such a deep truth in all of our beings. And so I found that the gene keys were really helpful to integrate that experience and make sense of what the purpose of that experience was, because it could have been another trip of like, that really messed up thing that happened, and it kind of just floats.
Yeah.
And it's up to us to actually take that experience and contemplate it, make meaning. What was it for? Because all of these medicines bring something up for a reason.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something that I found has been super helpful as well. Just like when something like that does come up, we may not necessarily have all the tools and the insight to really understand why, and we can definitely be like, oh, because when I was 12, I never really got to be a kid, so I keep going back to being a kid. And that's true, when you integrate it in that way. But it's just a lot more full and like clear when you have the map and you're like, oh, okay, I see this gene key here. It's my greatest challenge in life. Like I have to integrate more play and innocence, and that's where I derive inspiration and creativity, and chaos is just the doorway to that, instead of taking chaos seriously and like closing down with the chaos. So to answer that question, Austin, yeah, absolutely. I've had many psychedelic experiences and integrated them through the lens of my profile. And it's almost like I've had multiple that are almost like shocking to see the the layers of it. I mean, and it's also interesting to relate to, at least in my own experience, to see like how different psychedelics take you to different spheres of your profile. Like for me, psilocybin, for example, always brings me to my purpose. It always brings me to innocence. It always brings me to inspiration, the third gene key. Whereas like Bufo takes me right to my core. And so, yeah, just to share a little bit about that, go right to my core, because that's really like the juiciest part of it all. Where, like let's say that like a 3-day Bufo ceremony that I've done, it kept bringing me to this sphere, and this is all integration afterwards. While I was in it, I wasn't looking to my profile, I was just like really in it. And then afterwards, integrating through my profile, I was like, whoa, that's how that happened. I mean, my SQ right in the middle of your profile is your highest heart's expression. And it's also an area, a cycle that you would have worked with from 0 to 7 when you're realizing your physical boundaries of the world. So with Aga, it's the 59th gene key there. So intimacy, for me, it's the 5th gene key, which is impatience as the shadow, patience as the gift, and timelessness as the city. And impatience has been the strongest code that I've been working with for the last probably 4 years. Like I've been there. I've been like, I don't like how, like I'm so impatient. What do I like? Really journeying with that code of impatience and patience. And Bufo for the first really 2 sessions took me straight into there. It was like all around timelessness. It's like, this is what it feels like to let go of time. This is what it feels like to be an infinite timelessness and spaciousness, and how to surrender fully into that, and how I felt that so deeply in my heart. I remember those sessions, like my heart was just exploding with timelessness. And I think at one point I came out and I was like, oh, that's what it feels like to be on space and time, be beyond space and time. Um, and so it was interesting because that SQ then becomes, when you open that doorway of the gift and the city, it becomes a pathway for your core. So there's a pathway of realization there. And so it becomes the pathway for the highest realization of spirit to move through you. And that becomes your core. And the core is a very deep wound that's inherited at the point of conception. So it's a collective wound that we all carry, and it holds the most amount of depth. There's like your greatest challenge in relationships, your core wound, your highest aspect of spiritual realization, where it is that you're inspired to come from in service to the world. It's your vocation sphere. So it's wrapping up so much there, and it's located right in your core, right in the middle of your belly button. And I felt it through the first 2 sessions, like knocking so hard in my core. I was like, whoa. In the 3rd session I came out, I remember Deus's hand was like, I was holding it on my belly button, on my core. And there was so much coming through there. And for that gene key, for me, it's a really intense one. I have the 57th gene key, and it's the shadow of unease. It's really the first code that codes in through matter, and it's fear. It's like the quintessential of fear, unease. And then the pathway is clarity, and then intuition. And I have the 6th line there, and this is where it got intense, because from that point onward, through that whole experience for that 3rd session, and then 7 days, when I was sleeping every night, I would go into ceremony for 7 days following those 3 sessions. And I went into the ocean of suffering, like every point of like intense traumatic suffering that I almost feel like we have in the collective consciousness. And it was bringing me through all of these waves of the ocean of suffering every night when I would fall asleep. And it was really intense. And the gene keys was something that really helped me through that, because I was like, I have a 6th line there, which means it's actually meant for me to be initiated through all of our core wounds: repression, denial, shame, rejection, guilt, and isolation. So I was journeying through the archetypes of all of those core wounds, like how we repress our repression, deny our denial, we're shameful of our shame, we reject our rejection, we're guilty of our guilt, and then we want to isolate ourselves from all of it. So consciousness was like, here we go, we're going to go and layer through all of it. And that was really helpful for me, at least, to have that map, because I knew, like, kind of in a sense why that was happening. Because if I was just like, oh my gosh, instead personally I hold all of this darkness and it's so intense, like, what's wrong with me? I was able to flip it and be like, okay, it's a collective consciousness, like it's a collective shadow that I'm working with and transmuting, that's at the core of my being. And as I go deeper into it, the more of my core stability unlocks, the more of my heart opens, and et cetera, through the framework of the Gene Keys. And so that's one small scratch on the surface of how I've used my profile to integrate my experience through psychedelics. Very thankful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially when you come out of a journey that's challenging, mm-hmm. and you don't know how to make sense of it. The mind or the ego can come in and be like, oh no, this is wrong, this is bad, you're crazy, and you're kind of like grasping for something to make sense, for something to be okay, for this to be safe. Mm-hmm. And in those moments when, like, almost like the consciousness is being defragmented, there's a defragmentation process, right? And like that you describe, of like, oh, all these uncomfortable things, and resting into the unknowing that it's part of how we grow. You know, here's the map, this is proof. And also, if you go see, speak to a psychotherapist who, with integration, they'll be like, it's okay. These feelings are okay, these feelings are safe, this is how consciousness, the journey through consciousness moves. That's how we move, how we evolve. And we need to go through those sticky things, but knowing that, like, you're safe and it's totally okay.
Yeah, absolutely, like that. And also seeing, like, like we were speaking before the call, it's like you can drop out of those spaces and be completely in the dark and be like, who am I, what am I doing, where am I, why did this happen, why am I even here, like, what do I do with it? And you're just in the dark. But the Gene Keys is so helpful of giving you this light, and like, there's a path, that's the path. So like, that's the orientation, for me, with that sixth line of like, karmically agreeing to going through this initiation process of experiencing all of the suffering that there is to experience in really deep ways in this world. It's all for the gift of philanthropy, and like, that's a huge part of my nature, is philanthropy. And you almost can't really, like, I know I can't really sit in that seat of philanthropy without really being able to feel the nature of being a human and all that it comes with. And not just that, but like how we can use our suffering for alchemy, how we can use our suffering as a gift. That's the honest truth. Every shadow contains a gift. So for me to be able to personally experience what that is, and then come out the other side and really feel this, like, philanthropic service orientation towards supporting people on their journey of going through the shadow and finding the gift, like, it's like, that's where we really get to. It's interesting too, because that session that I started going into the ocean of suffering, my intention was, how can I truly be of the greatest service to the world? And that's where it brought me. And I was like, why? And then it came out the other end being like, oh yeah, because integrating all of that suffering has been such a profound, it's like, it's become so necessary for me in what it is that I know that I'm here to offer people. So it would be really scary if I didn't know that, and I thought, like, I was holding personally so much shadow, and I need to really focus on this. It's not the case. It just gives you like a very easy, streamlined navigation through darkness and light, but the same thing, really.
I got a question from Steph. How would you recommend we get started with the keys?
So there's definitely different access points. The first, I always recommend you can get your free profile on the Gene Keys website. You just need your birth date, time, and place. And then I really love to recommend The Art of Contemplation, which is Richard Rudd's. He calls it his masterpiece. He's the author of the Gene Keys. And it's a 100-page book, and it gives you the art form, the tools, the techniques that we use to approach the synthesis. So having that context is not only so imperative for approaching the gene key synthesis at large, but life in general and psychedelic journeys in general. And it's so simple, it's so easy to absorb, it's so accessible. I always recommend starting there. You can get that book as a paperback. I'm sure Banyan has it, Amazon or wherever you like to get your books. And the next is really just the Gene Keys book, because you can get your profile, and if again, you can look at those words, and you can't really take them at face value. It's interesting to see what your first perspective is, and then to pair it with what it's actually representing. So the Gene Keys book is a great way to get started. I first got started with it using it as an oracle. So every day I would just like open the book and read a sentence and be like, this is exactly what I needed to hear right now, like this theme. So that's a fun way of doing it. And then, of course, I'm here to offer profile sessions if you want to go deeper into what some of these themes mean overall, especially your line numbers, because that's a little bit harder to find. But yeah, those are some good access points to getting started. Absolutely.
Yeah, I found that it took me a few tries because I'd get into it and be like, so much, so
Yeah.
many words.
Mm-hmm.
Then I'd go back. And then what really helped was audios. So you can get the
Mm-hmm.
audio book. Um, and also, I believe he's on SoundCloud as well. There's some really good SoundCloud, like sound bites of Richard Rudd speaking about some of the sequences or the keys, and like with inspirational music. And that's nice to walk through. Like I like to walk through the forest and like, okay, today we're going to contemplate the third gene key. And it's like, oh, yes, it's like totally resonating. And so I recommend like getting your profile done, like you said, for free with the on the website on Gene Keys, which I posted in the chat, and beginning to contemplate those ones specific to you. And then definitely getting a reading, because somebody else can look at this. It's really cool, with you can, your mind really sees like systems and patterns and relationships between these things, and you just get like, you can see these connections that when you first look at it, you're like, okay, I just see lines and squares and blue and red, and like, what does this mean? So it's really helpful to have somebody else to just like, yeah, it's like the oracle, read your oracle to you through your own gene keys.
Yeah, it can be, when you look at it and you're like, what does this mean? It can be overwhelming at first, but patience is really a prerequisite. Learning patience more and more, but the patience to knowing like you don't have to understand it all at once. It's impossible to, so you just don't even try. Bit by bit, step by step, as it calls, you can enter into it. And Audible, there's a Gene Keys book on Audible, and there is a SoundCloud page. There's also a YouTube page. So there's tons of resources out there. And of course, you can always ask me. You can send me a message on Instagram if you want. I'll put my or on my webpage as well. I'll just put my thing there so that you can always send me any questions that you have. I'm happy to answer. And so I see there, Sarah, what if you don't know the exact time you were born? Does it vary drastically? If you don't know the exact time you were born, I recommend putting noon. That's typically a good, that's what we use. But if you know like morning, afternoon, night, then go with something around of where you think you were born. It it won't vary on the prime gifts, everything in green that you have, like the bedrock of your genius. And typically the insides won't change either if you have the time wrong, but the line numbers might. So if you want to be very specific, it is very helpful to know your exact birth time, but not entirely necessary. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone have any other questions? Feel free to put it in the chat. Yeah. How did you stumble upon the gene keys? What's your journey to finding them?
Well, I've always been obsessed with philosophies. That's just how my mind works. Asian philosophies and just maps of consciousness since I was like 16. That's where I've been at. But yeah, I started with human design, and that would have been about 10 years ago now. And Gene Keys, human design is kind of like the father, and Gene Keys is like the mother. Gene Keys actually kind of grew out of human design. You could say they share the same means of astrology calculations. But I actually first got into Gene Keys because I went through everything in human design and I was like, okay, what's next? Because I went through all of the material. And there was this book, I moved into this house and I had this bookshelf in my room that the roommate before me left, and the Gene Keys book was on it, and it kept calling me, kept bringing my eyes towards it. I was like, Gene Keys, Gene Keys, Gene Keys. And one day I just picked it up and I opened the book and I was like, oh, okay. Immediately my body was like, yes, 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 everything in the book. And so I started diving deeper into it. And this would have been probably about 7 years ago now. So yeah, that's really, that was the jumping point of the Gene Keys. And I found it to be, I use it at least as an offering more so than human design at this point, because it is a heart-based wisdom. It's a very like feminine, embodied heart-based wisdom that you can journey with. And that's something that I feel like is a very necessary medicine for today. Whereas human design is a little bit more cerebral, but also very helpful. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I find that the more and more I work in the psychedelic spaces, the benefit of introducing somebody who has never done plant medicines to something like the gene keys before a journey, and then potentially after, to begin to understand these spaces, because
Mm-hmm.
you can go in and have your whole world view just like totally flipped upside down, and then when you come back you're like, what, how do I make sense of life? And this kind of like helps in that transitioning, in that awakening, to be the almost like the basket that holds you through your journey and then catches you in the end. Yeah.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then also vice versa. It's like somebody who's been studying these keys goes into a plant medicine. It's like, oh, wow, like this map makes even more sense now because I'm living, right? Like you mentioned in your experience, I'm experiencing timelessness. Right, when in ego consciousness that's almost impossible, right? So it gives it's like they're so related, they're the bridges to one another, where they, one gives more understanding and then one gives the experience, the lived experience, so that they come together and weave into life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really, like the pairing of these things with the Gene Keys and psychedelic experience, which is all uh, an experiential wisdom that we hold, right? Because we have an experience with it in that way. It's very much in the body, and to really, I always love. I was it Ken Wilber, I believe, like came up with this sphere, this model of like a 360 degrees of equal parts of wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. And so to really like be with truth in that way, it kind of takes all of those things to integrate the experience, which comes from, the wisdom comes from the experience of it itself, the understanding, which is like the integration, and then the knowledge, which can be the philosophies that we find in books and frameworks. But yeah, with all that being said, for me, because I have adopted the Gene Keys framework, and it is a framework, it's a hologenetic framework as my lens of perception in full. It's not only my codes and what I see in my profile. It's from the beginning, it's always been like the big picture of things. And I view everything through the keys and the framework. Like whenever somebody says something to me, you were talking about forgetting and remembering. I'm like, that's the 33rd gene key. If you want to go deeper into that, that's the 33rd gene key. And so it's so helpful to have this framework to view the world with. Yeah, it's a beautiful thing that I hope to share with anyone and everyone who's interested. Mhm.
Yeah. On that note, I think time to wrap up. And I think it's a beautiful reminder too, that like the psychedelic journey is often the catalyst. It's not, it's like the thing, it's the opening. And then this is the map that like helps you to continue doing it. It's like a life's work, right? The journey, the medicine spaces open it up. And then it's our work to honor that plant medicine, honor that experience by continue doing our integration work, living what the realizations that we were gifted. And then that is how we create this new world that we're all moving into, where we want to see more love, more harmony, forgiveness. Oh my goodness. That thing which just fell has been stuck for like 2 years. It's been open for 2 years and it finally decided to close. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, anyhow, yeah, moving forward into this new way of being, where we're more loving towards ourselves and each other, like really embodying unconditional love. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you so much for your time today, for sharing. Yeah, big shifts. Yeah, for sharing your wisdom,
My
your
pleasure.
magic. Yeah, your medicine. And for those who are interested, definitely reach out to Emily for a reading. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'm grateful to speak more about this. It's such a significant topic of today, with so many people exploring these realms and not really having necessarily much context or tools to navigate before or after the experience. So thank you so much for opening this space up to me. And thank you everyone for coming and asking questions and being a part of the conversation. Yeah, it'd be great to meet you. So you can say hi anytime you'd like. Love to connect.
All right. Bye.
Ciao.